Um, Our next panel will consist of Andrew Tabler with the Washington Institute, Mona Yakubian with the Institute's Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention, Mara Carlin, an instructor in strategic studies at Johns Hopkins University of Advanced International Studies. Okay. And okay. And Mona, we're going to start with you. We're going to go from left to right. Or you're right to left, I don't know. We welcome you all here, and please feel free to summarize your statements. They'll all be included in the record, but we welcome your testimony, and Ms. Yakubian, we will begin with you. Yeah, okay, you got it. Okay.
Great, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this morning's hearing. I want to commend the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for holding this very important hearing on an issue of mounting concern, the human rights situation in Syria. I was asked to address the Syrian government's response to ongoing protests and the resulting human rights challenges. I'm going to keep my comments brief and ask that my prepared statement be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Please note that my comments are my own and do not reflect the views of the U.S. Institute of Peace, which does not take positions on policy. When a Tunisian fruit vendor's self-immolation last December ignited a wave of uprisings across the Arab world, few, if any, observers expected the Arab Spring to reach Syria. And yet, since mid-March, as has been noted, Syria has witnessed unprecedented popular protests, bringing tens of thousands of people to the streets in cities and countries across cities and towns across the country. The Syrian regime has responded to these largely peaceful demonstrations with harsh repression, giving rise to accusations that the Syrian government's brutal tactics, including systematic torture, indiscriminate killing, and arbitrary detentions, constitute crimes against humanity. International human rights organizations estimate that more than 1,400 Syrians have been killed and more than 10,000 arrested over the past 4 months. The government's violent crackdown has also provoked significant refugee flows, with more than 10,000 Syrians taking refuge in Turkey and another 5,000 in neighboring Lebanon. In some instances, Syrian security forces have fired on fleeing civilians in an attempt to prevent their escape. The Turkish government should be commended for providing assistance to the refugees. Nonetheless, conditions in the tent camps are difficult. In Lebanon, the Lebanese army was accused of detaining fleeing Syrian refugees in late May. While the Lebanese government asserts that detainees have been released, conditions for Syrian refugees in Lebanon also remain poor. Moreover, the Syrian uprisings' potentially destabilizing spillover effects in Lebanon could be significant. A larger scale influx of refugees could easily tip Lebanon's delicate sectarian balance. In addition, sectarian violence in the restive city of Tripoli has already erupted in connection with the Syrian unrest. On June 17th, pro-Syrian Alawites clashed with Sunnis demonstrating against the Assad regime, leaving 7 dead. The Lebanese army was mobilized to restore calm. Yet sectarian unrest could well resume in Tripoli and possibly elsewhere in Lebanon over the coming days and weeks, particularly if the situation in Syria continues to worsen. Numerous reports indicate the Syrian authorities have resorted to a number of deeply disturbing tactics in their efforts to put down the uprising. Particularly concerning is the extent to which children have been victims of the violence. As Assistant Secretary Posner noted earlier, the Syrian uprising itself was sparked by popular indignation at the regime's arrest of a group of teenagers in Deraa who scrawled graffiti calling for the regime's downfall. Most disturbing, a shocking YouTube video documents the brutal torture and killing of 13-year-old Hamza al-Khatib, who was arrested by Syrian security forces in late April. His mutilated body was returned to his parents 3 weeks later, a cruel attempt to intimidate others from joining the protests. Instead, the video went viral, served to galvanize the protesters, attracting more to the streets. The Syrian government's widespread human rights violations underscore that Bashar al-Assad's regime is not salvageable. Hollow promises of reform and cosmetic attempts at dialogue with the opposition are belied by the regime's blatant brutality on the streets. In its most recent effort, the Syrian government sponsored a two-day national dialogue that concluded yesterday. However, most opposition groups boycotted the talks, citing the regime's ongoing repression and its imprisonment of thousands of political activists. Indeed, at the same time that the talks were being conducted, Syrian troops stormed into homes, firing on demonstrators. Instead, protesters are insisting that the regime cease its violent repression, release all political prisoners, and ultimately step down from power. Any basis for Western engagement with Syria has now vanished. The regime's brutal response to popular demands for dignity and freedom has rightly earned it widespread international condemnation. Yet more must be done to pressure the regime to cease its repression and seed the way for a genuine democratic transition in Syria. While the United States does not wield the same leverage with Syria as it did with Egypt, it can still spearhead a multilateral effort targeting the Syrian regime. For a variety of reasons, military intervention is not appropriate in the Syrian case, and indeed, Syrian opposition figures both inside and outside the country have stressed that they do not favor this course. Referring Syria to the International Criminal Court, while perhaps warranted by the regime's behavior, is also not likely to succeed and may obstruct more potent venues for pressuring the Syrians. Instead, international efforts should focus on the regime's critical vulnerabilities, namely the cost to an already weakened economy of heightened international isolation. Even prior to the current unrest, the Syrian economy was reeling from years of drought and economic mismanagement. The current uprising has already exerted a toll on the Syrian economy. The country's foreign exchange reserves are reportedly running low, and the economy has virtually ground to a halt. Syria is now on track to post negative GDP growth for this year. In conclusion, I would recommend the following. Specifically, the United States should accelerate efforts with Russia, South Africa, and Brazil to pass a United Nations Security Council resolution condemning Syria and laying the groundwork for broader international isolation. Second, we should seek European trade restrictions and ultimately multilateral sanctions targeting Syria's oil and gas sector, which is a particularly resilient segment of the Syrian economy. Third, the United States should coordinate with regional powers, particularly Turkey, which is a key trading partner for Syria, and the Gulf states to ensure Syria's regional economic isolation by discouraging their trade and investment with Syria. Fourth, the U.S. should seek broader support for an international arms embargo on Syria. Fifth, the U.S. should ensure the continuing presence of Ambassador to Syria Robert Ford. His courageous trip to Hama last week, along with his French counterpart, is credited with having possibly abated more violent repression of protests. Finally, the U.S. should continue to pressure Syria to allow a United Nations Human Rights Commission delegation seeking to investigate Syria's human rights violations entry into the country. In closing, I want to reiterate the importance of the deteriorating human rights situation in Syria. While the wall of fear has certainly crumbled, the Syrian regime's reflexive reliance on repression appears unwavering. The United States and the international community more broadly should support the protesters' calls for change in Syria, for their right to dignity, respect for human rights, and democracy. I once again want to express my appreciation for the opportunity to address the Commission. Thank you for holding this hearing today.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tabler?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to testify here today before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission on the Assad regime's 4-month brutal crackdown on Syria's pro-democracy protesters. Throughout my 7-year career as a journalist and analyst based in Damascus, I followed Tom Lantos's often critical words on the Assad regime's policies with great interest. And it's good to know that this body continues to carry on his good work. The Assad regime's response to the protests in Syria, which Mona has just outlined, I could generally define as a policy of the iron fist and the velvet glove. On the one hand, the regime continues to use live fire to gun down protesters, whose death toll now is around 1,500 or so, and has arbitrarily arrested around 12,000 more. Widespread reports of beatings and torture abound, many of which have been verified by human rights activists on the ground in Syria. Internet videos show the horrific torture of some of those arrested and killed under torture as well, including 13-year-old Hamza Ali al-Khatib, whose dramatic torture Mona described a little bit earlier. On the other hand, the Assad regime continues to offer, quote, dialogue with what it calls, quote, legitimate protesters, but blames most of the unrest on what it calls armed gangs roaming the Syrian countryside. The Syrian opposition isn't buying it, with most, if not all, boycotting the dialogue until the regime withdraws its security forces from major cities and towns and agrees to a process whereby President Bashar al-Assad launches a transition to true democratic rule. Recently, I journeyed to Lebanon's Wadi Khalid to visit with Syrian refugees who fled the Sunni Muslim village of Tel Khalak, which is surrounded by a constellation of villages dominated by Alawites, the heterodox offshoot of Shia Islam from which the Assad regime hails. What I found was appalling. A people traumatized by roving gangs predominantly made up of Alawites called the Shabiha, or ghosts, who threatened to kill or assault protesters in the Syrian countryside and around Syria's coastal cities. Sporting shaved heads and black outfits mixed with camouflage, these groups are believed to report directly to members of the Assad family. This wasn't the first group of refugees I've interviewed in my career, but they were the first to have video footage on cell phone cameras ready for me, where moving images speak a million or more words. They showed me clips of the Shabiha's handiwork, including the ransacking and burning of Tel Khalak villagers' houses and farms. They showed me footage of snipers shooting at them as they crossed the Great Southern River, which is nothing more than a small stream in American terms, into the Wadi Khalid pocket in Lebanon. They also told me of the Syrian regime's use of cannon fire against their village the previous week, a fact confirmed to me by Western correspondents who were in Wadi Khalid at the same time and heard the assault firsthand. This followed similar stories found in Western press in the weeks running up to my visit. The cannon fire had been used around Deraa, the southern Syrian city where the protests essentially began on March 18th. The refugees from Tel Khalak are afraid to return home, and they are assured that the regime's security forces will quickly arrest them and usher them away for questioning and ensure torture. For Syrian Sunnis, this conjures up memories of the trauma of the 1982 Hama Massacre, where the regime used artillery to level large parts of Syria's fourth largest city, killing up to 30,000 people. At the same time, the regime used the assault on Hama to justify arrests of any political opponents in the 80s. Many of those arrested were never heard from again, which today make up the country's disappeared. As I drove along the perimeter of the Wadi Khalid pocket adjacent to the Syrian border, the sight of Syrian security forces mingling with Shabiha gangs clearly justified the refugees' fears. And it was also clear to me that the Assad regime's use of the Shabiha was provoking the sectarian war that it publicly said it wants to avoid at all costs. Since then, similar assaults have taken place in Idlib Governorate, located in the northwestern Syria along its border with Turkey. Peaceful protesters in the city of Jisr al-Shughur, calling for the fall of the Assad regime, were assaulted by regime security and military forces. In the face of the assault, some of Jisr al-Shughur's residents fought back. Given the sectarian tensions stirred up in the area by the regime, this should not come as a surprise. In addition, all of Syria's border zones are smugglers' dens, where residents are often armed. The ensuing fighting in Jisr al-Shughur and neighboring villages has sent over 12,000 Syrian refugees into Turkey. Ankara has thus far welcomed the refugees with open arms and good facilities, but has shied away from allowing reporters into the camps. Journalists have been able to reach refugees stranded in the border zone between the two countries, however. While the exact details of what happened in Jisr al-Shughur are still unclear, what is clear is that the refugees fear returning home and incurring the wrath of the Assad regime's security forces. Turkey is now preparing to receive more refugees as protests grow in size and strength. Ankara is also now rumored to be considering establishing a buffer zone inside of Syria to better deal with the refugee issue.